So I just wanted to say a really big welcome to Professor Alison Anderson, who we're delighted to have speaking to members and friends of the UKSSN today. And so Alison will be talking about how communication is key to fighting the climate crisis. And so this is a topic which I find personally extremely important, as probably many of us do, especially since there's so much misinformation on social media. But also, I think it's really important to be able to convince people that are already concerned by climate change to make impactful changes in their own lives. And so if you have any questions for Alison throughout the talk, just please post them in the chat and we'll ask them at the end of her presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm really pleased to be here this evening, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion later on and the questions. I'm a social scientist based at the University of Plymouth. You can see Plymouth behind me. I'm not actually by the waterfront at the moment. And so I'm going to be discussing some of the issues around communicating the climate crisis today, focusing on the really important role of the education system and media. So it's just an overview of what I'm going to be covering. I'm going to start off by talking a little bit about some of the challenges involved in communicating the climate crisis. Then moving on to look at the issue of balance, which has proved to be particularly influential in the past in terms of influencing the way in which the media has covered climate change. Then going to go on to talk a little bit about the relationship between the media coverage, how the media presents climate change, and public attitudes, so people's attitudes towards the issue. And then finally talking a little bit about misinformation and disinformation in the media. So misinformation is inaccurate information that we find in the media sometimes about climate change. Disinformation is deliberate false information that we sometimes find in media coverage, which may act as a barrier to action on climate change. So it's a really important topic to look at. Then I'm just going to end with a few concluding comments. And we're going to be showing you a short film that I've recently made looking at youth voices in climate education. And you'll get to hear some of the views of the young people who were in a piece of research that I carried out with the British Science Association about their views on education, and you'll also hear from some journalists as well. So we know that the vast majority of scientists agree that climate change is mainly caused by humans and is real. 99.9% of peer-reviewed scientific papers agree that. So why haven't we got any further with solving the climate crisis? Well, a key issue is to do with how the issues are communicated and with politics. And we know that those people who have contributed the least to climate change will suffer the most. And, you know, we've seen so many impacts already in terms of flooding, in terms of wildfires, rising temperatures right around the world. And yet we're not taking the action that we need to really make a difference quick enough. So why is that? Well, David Attenborough made this comment at the G7 summit, which was a meeting of world leaders, which actually took place in Cornwall in the UK in October 2021, where he noted that tackling climate change is as much a political and communication challenge as it is a scientific or technological one. I think that's a really important observation there, that we've moved beyond the science now. We have the scientific evidence. We just need to act. But one of the issues with the communication and relationship between communication and behaviour change is that it's really complicated. So, we have the evidence, but we don't necessarily act on that evidence. Why is that? Well, a lot of it is to do with habits, with habitual behaviour that we don't really question. If you think about food, for example, we have lots of information about the dangers of eating sugary foods, high fat content foods, and yet sometimes it's really difficult to act on that and avoid eating those kind of foods. We may be seduced by the advertising, we may have got into a habit of eating a particular food, we become almost addicted to it. And it's similar in a way with climate change and individual behaviours. It can be really difficult to actually break those habits. There are all sorts of barriers. In some cases, it can be to do with financial barriers, but also there are a number of other barriers that I'm going to be talking about in a moment, linked to misinformation and disinformation about the climate crisis. If we look at trends in public opinion, it's quite clear that the vast majority of people in this country say they are concerned about climate change. So this refers to a large-scale representative survey, so covering the whole population, and this found that 77% of people say that they are concerned about climate change. This was carried out in the summer of 2023, and only 23% say they're not concerned about climate change. And what we know from these studies is that men and women have broadly similar responses, but females are slightly more likely to say that they are concerned about climate change, and also they view climate change as being a personal threat compared to men. And interestingly, it tends to be those people over the age of 65 who are most likely to say they are concerned, because we normally think of young people as being the ones that are most concerned. So the extent to which there's a big generation gap between younger people and older people in some cases has been exaggerated, but what we do know is that younger people perceive climate change to be more of a threat. And, we know that a lot of young people are very worried and afraid about the future. So thinking about this then, what we find is that a lot of people are quite confused about the information and who to trust. Around about half, 51% of people in a survey that was carried out by the Department of Energy Security and Net Zero in 2023 agree that the information that they're finding is often conflicting. Just to give you an example, in the Daily Mail newspaper recently, there have been a lot of anti-electric vehicle articles. So as an example, you can see here with the headline, "Why Electric Cars Are Not Green Machines." And, we often see these kind of articles either in newspapers. I know young people don't by and large tend to read newspapers, and we'll come on to the role of social media a bit later. But this is just an illustration really of some of the misleading information that you sometimes find within the media. And there's a very good article that basically debunks 21 myths about electric vehicles in what's called Carbon Brief. which I haven't got really time to go into now. But, very often we read about these myths about electric cars being more likely to catch fire, which is not the case. They're not more likely to catch fire than petrol or diesel cars. And it's interesting with the fire that took place at the car park in Luton Airport that people immediately started blaming electric vehicles when actually it was a diesel vehicle. So it's really important to make sure that we have accurate information about some of the proposed solutions to the climate crisis. Now, certainly in the past, the media tried very hard to kind of balance climate scientists with climate skeptics, so people who doubted the reality of climate change, to provide a kind of for versus against position within articles and on television. And now you're less likely to find that happening, thankfully, because the problem with that is that it gave the misleading impression that scientists weren't agreed on, the reality of climate change, and that humans were mainly the cause of the problems that we face. But as recently as July 2021, I don't know if you remember this or if you heard about this, but BBC Bitesize, that you probably use for some of your lessons, got into a massive controversy because, alongside listing negative impacts from climate change, they also listed a number of positive climate change impacts. And this caused a massive controversy, and they had to, in the end, take down that page because it was very misleading. It was trying to present a balanced picture of climate change, which was certainly not very helpful at all. So thinking about the role of the media, then I've done a lot of research over the last 30 odd years looking at the way in which journalists cover environmental issues, including climate change. And in one of my books, I discuss the role of the media in terms of how the media can give voice to certain perspectives and credibility to those perspectives compared to others. So what I mean by this is through the choice of particular words, or through the choice of particular images, or the inclusion of certain information or excluding particular facts, you create a particular version of reality. So just to give you an example of that, one study was looking at how eco-activists were portrayed in different newspapers. And in one newspaper, the Daily Telegraph, which tends to be conservative supporting sort of right-wing newspaper, the eco-activists were referred to using words like arrogant, militant, and bearded. Apologies to anybody who's here with a beard. And the other newspaper they looked at was the Daily Mirror, which is a more left-wing newspaper, more likely to support the Labour Party. And they chose to talk about the eco-activists using words like heroic, daring, idealistic. So conveying a completely different picture of the eco-activists compared to the other newspapers. That's just one illustration of how choice of words can create a very different impression and make a particular individual or group credible or less credible. Now, looking at trends in the way in which newspapers have covered climate change, this is a graph showing how newspaper coverage has kind of gone through various peaks and troughs over time. So it's looking at the period 2000 to right up to the present day to 2023. It doesn't include all newspapers, and it is only newspapers, but nevertheless, it does give us a little bit of an indication of the volume of coverage over this period. And it's really interesting to see that there are particular peaks over time. So there was a big peak here at the end of 2010, another big peak here, end of 2015. We get a massive big peak in 2021. Now, what's interesting is that all of these big jumps in the amount of coverage in newspapers are linked to when the COP summits take place. So the COP summits COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the big summits where world leaders gather together. We've got one coming up very soon, haven't we, in Dubai, COP 28. And so the biggest jump, if you like, in attention to climate change that we see in this graph here was the 2021 climate summit, because that happened in Glasgow. So from a media point of view, it was particularly interesting because it wasn't some faraway country, it was actually our own country. So that's why there was more coverage. Now, what's interesting is that there's often a relationship between the amount of attention a topic gets in the media and what the public say they think are the most important issues. Now, it's quite complicated. It's not a simple relationship between media coverage and public opinion and what people think. And people don't, we know people don't automatically believe everything they see or read in the newspapers. But the power of the media is particularly in terms of setting what we might call an agenda. So in other words, if BBC News is leading all the time on the economy for a period of time and talking about the financial crisis, then what we know is that if you ask the average person in the street what is the most important issue at the moment, they'll say it's the economic crisis because they've been bombarded with news about that. So if we have a look at the results of an opinion poll survey carried out in November 2021. So this was right at the time when the Glasgow COP summit was occurring, when the researchers asked a representative sample of the public, what do you see as the most important issues facing Britain today? We find that pollution, environment and climate change came top. And actually 1 in 4 people said that they thought those issues were the most important issues facing the country. But if we move on only a month later, so in December 2021, look what's happened. Only 13% of the public now are saying that pollution, environment, climate change is the most important issue. And it had dropped a number of places from its top position. And instead, coronavirus pandemic disease was perceived to be the most important issue facing the country. And, if you look at the moment to see what people are saying in terms of what they see as the most important issue facing Britain today, it's the economy. So it goes in waves, in peaks and troughs, but it is influenced by the media coverage. So finally then, before we go on to view the film, I just wanted to talk very quickly about some of the techniques of misinformation and disinformation that are a barrier to real climate action being taken and solving the climate crisis. So what we know is that there are these really powerful, what we call lobby groups, who act on behalf of business. So in this case, oil and gas companies, for example, and PR stands for public relations companies. So public relations companies work for industry and try to help them have the best possible image. So they kind of spin things for them. And what we know is that these very powerful groups, especially in the US, but not only in America, have manipulated scientific claims and exploited the news media. So just one example of that is the way in which, in the past, the American Enterprise Institute, which is funded by an oil company, said that they would pay £10,000 to scientists, to economists, if they agreed to write articles which were, that the sole purpose of these articles were to cast doubt on the IPCC reports, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. So behind the scenes, there are these very powerful groups who are trying to manipulate things and are trying to influence news media coverage. And you can read a lot more about this in the book by Naomi Oreskes, Merchants of Doubt, which is a really interesting book. And they have borrowed from the playbook that the tobacco industry used because there was mounting evidence that tobacco is, or smoking is linked to cancer, but the tobacco industry for a long, long time denied that there was a link between smoking and cancer. And the climate change skeptics have borrowed the same kind of tactics, even used the same public relations company to try and avoid actually taking any actions. So using the exact same kind of tactics. Another example, briefly talk about here, of a smear campaign was in the run-up to the COP summit in Copenhagen in 2009, over 1,000 emails from scientists who were based at the University of East Anglia were hacked into and made public. And we don't know exactly who was behind this, but the goal of it was basically to try to imply that scientists were kind of manipulating the data and to sow the seeds of doubt about, the reality of climate change and the evidence. Now, subsequently, after that, there was a lot of controversy, and journalists increasingly thought they had to balance views about climate change following this, because they started doubting the evidence as well. But then there were two independent inquiries and also a government select committee that found that there was no evidence whatsoever of malpractice. But by then, the damage had been done, because this hacking occurred deliberately right in the run-up to this major COP conference in 2009. And, it caused a lot of damage. A lot of people started doubting the scientific evidence as a result of this, even though there was no evidence whatsoever, to support the claims. So now it's more an issue of these lobby groups trying to delay action because we've gone beyond, sizable numbers of people denying climate science. But what they are trying to do is to delay things. And this is an interesting book written by a US climate scientist, Michael Mann, called The New Climate War, where he talks in a bit more detail about some of the kind of tactics that are being used to delay action. And then finally, just a few words on what's going on with COP28. We know that that's taking place very soon, and there has been some controversy already because Sultan Al-Jaber is presiding over COP28, but the controversy is because he is head of an oil company. So there's a question of whether there's a conflict of interest there. And there is some evidence of greenwashing going on. So in other words, what we mean by greenwashing is where somebody is being portrayed, as caring about the environment, and it's not kind of they're not sort of giving the full picture. Also, a piece of research was carried out by a researcher at university in Qatar, and they identified that on Twitter there were over 100 fake accounts that were designed to present the United Arab Emirates, which is hosting the COP conference, in a good light. And we see all these different fake accounts here that have since been taken down. And even journalists have been, convinced by these and didn't realise that they were necessarily fake. And there's this one here where they actually, they clearly used a website that generates through AI images, but they forgot to crop this bit at the top where you can see it comes from thispersondoesnotexist.com. So just to conclude then, communication is so important. We are at a really critical stage now where we have to take action. But when we're thinking about, what the most effective communication is, it needs to engage with people's interests. We can't preach. That's not going to work. It has to engage with people where they are in terms of their own personal interests, and you'll hear more about that in a moment in the film, so I won't say anything more about that. Also, I think that climate change and media literacy must be embedded in every single subject in the curriculum. It's so vitally important that young people, are aware of the kind of issues that I've been talking about this evening. Education alone isn't going to fix the problem, but I think if education focuses especially on the solutions that we can take, and there are so many solutions out there, and provide people with a sense that they can make a difference, that they do have the power to make difference. That's really important. But as well as that, I think the most important thing to recognise is that it's only really through putting pressure on politicians and trying to influence the political system that we can introduce, laws, taxes, things like that, which will achieve large-scale change. Just to end, if you think about seatbelts, well, we all wear seatbelts now, don't we, in cars? We don't even think about it. But, you know, a law had to be introduced for that. And that's just a simple behaviour change. But the government couldn't rely on people voluntarily putting seatbelts on, because prior to that, you know, been a long period where people were driving without seatbelts, and it seemed like a real infringement to personal liberty to have to put on a seatbelt. So, you know, there's a lot of information out there about, you know, the safety of wearing seatbelts, and that, you know, if you don't wear a seatbelt, you're more likely to be injured, you may even die. But that wasn't enough for people to actually, you know, act. So my final comment really, I think, is that, you know, for real change, what we need is individual behaviour change. Yes, that's beneficial, but alongside that, we also need to press for more systemic change. So I'll leave it there now, because I know we're probably running out of time a little bit, and I think now we've just got a bit of chance to see a clip from the film.
Yes, I'll put the film on now. I'll probably play about 5, 6, 7 minutes, depending how we go, so that we've got time for questions at the end.
My name's Alison Anderson, and I'm a social scientist based at the University of Plymouth, researching climate communication. Tackling the climate crisis is now as much a communication challenge as it is a scientific or technological one. I hope this film will give you some insight into the views of young people and media professionals about the challenges involved in communicating the issues, focusing on the education system and the role of the media.
Personally, like Di said, I learned a lot about it in like geography, and that's like the main source really. So I suppose people who don't do it don't really know that much all about it, especially our age.
People who like do geography, for example, in school, they'll know like who it's affecting more. Whereas like we was talking about earlier with like people who have to migrate because of climate change, well, if you're not looking and educating yourself about it, you're not going to have any idea that people actually have to change their life like now.
And also, this isn't something we get taught as in school. You may have a few lessons about it, but then it's forgotten, and I think it should be more visible within society. About this climate change should be more visible within society, so we should have someone somewhere who's trying to project it. And there are voices, take Extinction Rebellion for example. They do try, they have their protests, they have their strikes, but there may not be enough people who want to join these, or there may be people who find them, let's say, annoying.
I recently carried out a piece of research with the British Science Association that involved surveying 1,000 young people between the ages of 14 and 18 about their secondary education. One of the things that we found was that climate education tends to be siloed within GCSE science and geography. Geography is optional, so what that means is that many young people aren't receiving very much information about the climate crisis. And where they are coming across it, it tends to be a confusing and disjointed narrative. To address this, climate change needs to be embedded right across the curriculum in every subject area, and also include green careers education as well in its widest sense.
They're thinking very short term in their political party, and they know that if they keep England financially stable, or whatever country this government is, that they will be more likely to get re-elected, because focusing a lot more on climate change will probably have negative financial effects, which in the short term will make their party perhaps more unpopular.
Yeah. While Greta may create a figurehead for us, I also think it's kind of saddening that a child had to step out of school and go around the world to tell politicians what they were doing wrong, because they didn't see the problem that was staring them in the face.
I think even now she's only seen as a symbol by politicians. They're not actually listening to her, they just think it's, you know, they just call her amazing and wonderful for doing it, but like she says, there's just a lot of empty words kind of being thrown at her and at us. Yeah, and I think the general consensus among governments is, oh, the kids will sort it out when they're older, and they're kind of almost waiting for us to grow up and be able to sort it out when it will be too late at that point. We can't really sort it out because there is no time for us to grow up and accumulate wealth. So it's a nice idea, I suppose, that we will solve it, but I think they're definitely going to have to start that change. We can't really do that.
Media, they have a lot of responsibility in terms of making sure that, you know, they understand that, for example, when youth go on the streets, the message that we are passing is not that we are in the streets, it's that we want you to focus on the urgency behind climate change. And so whatever ways we decide to bring the subject up, media is really crucial for media to understand that it's about the message and not the way we want to bring the message. And they got that responsibility to put that forward, to put that message forward. And they've got the responsibility also to engage citizens. When you talk about the consequences of climate change, you just look at floods or fires, and then you just show that on the news without really telling anything more than the fact that it's happening. Well, that's just saying facts, cool. But what about you explain to us, how is that linked to our everyday life? How can actually our consumption of every single day here in Europe is actually linked to the deforestation or the fires in the Amazon forests? Links is about reality. It's about showing the full reality that climate change is not only about this one flood or this one thing, it's a whole system. And we can be part of the change. We can be part of the solution.
On top of that, I think a lot of young people are growing up with an attitude to the world which is very different to the one that I grew up with, or people slightly older than me grew up with. And there's a great deal of nihilism, I think, among young people, a great deal of a sense that there's nothing that can be done. And I think often when we talk about climate change, we don't really acknowledge these fears and these really deep-rooted and often very justifiable anxieties and depression surrounding climate change. And so not only do we communicate climate change using old-fashioned approaches to media, we also don't take into account that a lot of young people aren't coming to climate change needing to be convinced that it's serious. They're coming to climate change needing to be convinced that there's anything we can do at all. And I think that's something a lot of climate communicators who've been doing a great job for many years often miss, and I often sometimes get that balance wrong as well myself.
I don't think it's journalists' job to persuade people and businesses to do that, but I think we can play a role in showing what's possible and shining a light on the amazing things that are already happening, whether that's green chemists or entrepreneurs or different countries doing things differently. I think there's definitely a way that we can amplify those voices and make them heard a bit more, but I don't think it's about preaching and telling people to stop doing things. I think it's about, look at what's happening, this is really, really cool, take a look at this. So I struggle with the narrative that we should put all our hope on the younger generation, because that's an enormous amount of pressure and it's not their mess. It's the grown-ups in charge now, the people in government, the people voting, who have the agency to make a really, really quick, big change. I don't think we've got time to wait for the people who are teenagers now to become politicians and business leaders and environmentalists and community leaders. I think we need to listen to their voices and include them in this conversation. And absolutely, we should be kind of linking that all up. But I don't think it's just down to them and their problem. I think we just don't have time to act in 20 years' time. We need to be doing it now. Traditionally, I also think that shock tactics have been the kind of primary tactic for headlines. And it feels like there's a much bigger wave of solutions-focused media now, so that this constructive journalism that is looking at progress, innovations, the change makers who are doing amazing things, and this is what I specialise in my work as well. So it's not PR puff, it's not just happy news and kittens have been rescued, that sort of thing. It's still very, very analytical, And we're really focused on thinking critically about what the solutions might be, what's scalable, what the limitations might be. But giving people hope, I think, is a really interesting way to engage people. And if things are too overwhelming, people switch off and they step away and they disengage. And if you connect people to something and think, actually, we could create a much more exciting, greener future with a circular economy and all of these really amazing prospects, you've got those pull factors. And I think news and media in general could do a lot more about embedding that into all different platforms and different news forms, I suppose.
We definitely get the sense from our readers, or at least the vocal minority of our readers.
I'm going to stop that there, and that was really interesting. So it's a real shame to have to stop that, but I will ask Alison, if we can share that with people. So is there anything you want to add before we go on to questions? Oh, you're on mute, Alison.
Oh, sorry. No, I don't think so.
Brilliant. Gabrielle and Lucy, would you like to take over questions that are appearing in the chat?
Yes.
Yeah. So thank you, Alison. I found that really interesting, and especially about how where you are on the political spectrum, that can affect how kind of climate activists are represented. So I think the first question is, if the most effective communication engages with people's interests and emotions, do you think it would be helpful if emotions were included in climate education?
That's a really good question. Yes, I think there should be some discussion of emotions, in education, because, that is where, we know a lot of people are quite understandably worried, afraid about what's happening, about what's going to happen in the future. And I think it's really important that education plays a role in what we call resilience. So making people feel more that they can cope with things and that they have ways of addressing problems and they know about solutions that we can take. So I think that's really important to ensure that we do actually address emotions in education.
Great, thank you.
So there's also a question from Philip about groups like Just Stop Oil and their chosen methods of communicating the urgency of climate change. And it asks whether there's any research to suggest that like shock factor and divisive tactics are effective, or if the message might get lost and make them really easy targets for right-wing media. And yeah, this was actually something I was going to ask myself about, whether you think they're doing more harm than good, or whether the attention that they're getting is enough.
Thanks. Again, that's a really good question, and a question that often comes up as well. I think when you're trying to measure the success of a group like Just Stop Oil, it depends on, if their goal is to actually make politicians, policymakers listen, then, it needs to be judged in terms of whether they actually do have an effect on policy, or is their goal more about making the issue visible within the media? And certainly through, the various activities that they do, they have brought about a lot of publicity. Some researchers say, well, actually, that's been quite negative because members of the public, don't tend to be supportive. So it really depends on how you measure success. And, it's difficult as well because, they may well have an impact on policy in the long term. I don't know. But certainly in the short term, we are at the moment backtracking on net zero. We're expanding, in terms of oil and gas. So, on the face of it, it doesn't appear as though they have been successful. But, they certainly have brought more visibility to the issues.
And it says from Emma, you mentioned secondary curriculum in the film. What are your viewpoints on the importance of climate education in primary schools?
That's another good one. Yeah, I mean, my focus has been on secondary education. I carried out a big survey of 1,000 young people between the ages of 14 and 18. And we also held some workshops with young people to find out about their views about climate education. But I don't think it's just an issue for secondary education. It needs to be introduced at as earlier age as possible, really, because I think once children feel like they have a strong connection to nature, whether that's going out, to parks, getting involved with growing vegetables in their school, learning about wildlife, about the natural environment, that kind of thing, then, I think that really does help them to get a better understanding of our relationship to, nature and more like to care about the planet. And so it's incredibly important that, these issues aren't just taught in the secondary curriculum, but young people are introduced to these kind of issues from an earlier age at primary school as well.
So there's a question from Rachel who asks if you think we need a mixture of positive and negative stories about climate change, or if you think that negative stories make people switch off entirely.
Yeah, I mean, there is a danger with doom and gloom stories, particularly if they just lead people to feel like there's nothing they can do. That's not very helpful at all. Having said that, though, I mean, thinking about somebody like Greta Thunberg, she's been very effective, I think, in her messaging. But the one thing she does, as well as talking about the negative impacts of climate change, she does also give people a sense of agency that, we can do something to address the issues. And I think that's a really important thing that, if you are talking about negative effects and impacts, it needs to be accompanied by, some sense of hope and agency. Otherwise, people just switch off or feel as though the issue's too big, that they can't do anything to to contribute.
Thank you.
And I have a question about how would you recognize on social media whether it's kind of fake or tampered with news about climate change? Like, is there any way of telling?
Again, that's another really good question. Yeah, I mean, I think we all have to be really careful, because it's so easy to be taken in, especially on social media, and to know what's fact and what's fiction. But fortunately, now we do have things like Fact Check website, where you can actually, go and check the accuracy of a claim. And I don't know if you might not be on Twitter, but on Twitter they have an account as well. So there are organisations now that specialise in this, and it's always good to double check something before you share it, because increasingly we're going to be coming across this problem more and more now, with GPT and artificial intelligence. It's becoming more and more difficult, isn't it, to tell whether something's real or not. As in the examples I was showing at the end of the presentation, where some journalists were even, taken in by those fake accounts.
So there is a question about your views on integrating climate education into the curriculum without it being overwhelming for students.
Yeah, I mean, I think that climate change needs to be included right across the curriculum in every subject. But I think it needs to be done, very carefully, very thoughtfully. I mean, there are all sorts of ways in which it can be introduced. So if you think about maths, for example, and some of the examples that you could use in maths, you could be calculating the amount of solar energy, coming from solar panels, something like that. So just bring it into different examples in different subjects. It doesn't have to be completely overwhelming, but I think the fact that it's there is really important, even as in a subject like physical education. Think how could climate change come into that area? But I mean, in terms of discussing the benefits of exercise and walking, cycling, those kind of things, helps with sustainable travel. So there are all sorts of ways that climate change can be brought into the curriculum without it being completely overwhelming. And as I said before, if it focuses, very much on solutions, then I think that's where, it will be helpful, because it will lead people, I think, to have a greater sense that they can make a contribution and do something, and that, it's not a lost cause, but we can actually take decisive action ourselves.
And we have another question. What do you think is the best, most effective method of convincing the government to really put pressure on the OPEC countries like the UEA, who are openly greenwashing more and more?
Oh, that's quite a question, isn't it?
Yeah,
yeah, it's very, very tricky, really. I mean, the government itself has got a long way to go, really, I think, in making sure that it does actually meet its targets. And I think, there's a lot that the government can do to concentrate on its own record, aside from sort of tackling what's going on in other countries. I mean, I think, sort of reflecting on COP28, it's happening at such a critical time, and it could, be a really decisive conference. And hopefully, the government, the leaders will actually make, great strides towards deciding on loss and damage, and which countries should be supported, where the money is going to come from. It should make or it could potentially make quite an impact in terms of the stock taking that's going on, and seeing how far different countries have actually gone in terms of the pledges that they made and how much progress they've made. And certainly, now with the COPs, the fossil fuel companies are much more involved in the discussions, right around the world in different countries. And hopefully they won't be, able to kind of, sort of influence things by just making minimal changes that, don't have too much of an impact on their own position and their own profits. But we'll have to see about
that. So Meryl mentioned that the Department for Education are monitoring some teachers who feel that they're pushing too hard for curriculum reform on climate and sustainability education. And she asks if you feel that teachers should back down and toe the line, or if they should keep trying to promote change.
Yeah, I had heard that actually. I think teachers should continue to press for climate change to be, at the forefront of the curriculum. It's the greatest challenge that we face. And, as I said at the beginning, education and the media are absolutely vital for solving these issues. So I definitely think that teachers shouldn't back down, and that they have every right to suggest that climate change is part of the curriculum and embedded right across the different subject areas.
Thank you.
Okay. I think I saw one comment in the chat about the film asking if it was going to be available. Is that right?
Yeah, someone was asking if we'd be able to share it.
Yeah. Well, it's literally only just been completed the last few days, but it will be available on YouTube shortly. So I can certainly send Rachel the link, maybe a week or so, I don't know. But it shouldn't be long, and then you'll be able to see the whole of the film.
Thank you for that.
Okay.
Lucy, would you like to wrap up?
Yeah, so thank you so much for coming. I'm sure everyone found it really interesting, and I think we're all really grateful. And I didn't really know anything about how communication is vital. I think it's one of the things that's all around you, but you don't realize how much it has an impact. But thank you so much for coming and speaking.
Thank you very much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much, Alison. It looks like we've still got quite a few questions. Would you be happy for people to drop you and ask you any questions?
Yeah, sure. Very happy. Yep.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think it's really interesting because when I was at Plymouth University doing some research into education for sustainable development in higher education, we had a lot of students who were doing environmental science, and they were really committed to climate change and making a difference. But when we interviewed them about how they felt about their course, they felt that it was actually putting them off doing anything and working in climate change, because all they were confronted with was negative situations, and that's all they were taught about, and they were never taught about how to actually make the change. So it does make it even more important about how we frame climate change to young people, even when they're at an older age. So I think it's been a really useful conversation to think about exactly how we're framing communication and education for young people. So thank you so much, Alison, and thank you so much to Gabrielle and Lucy for hosting. You did an absolutely fantastic job. It has been great to see everyone here. And this will go up on YouTube, so I will share it with everyone once that has been completed. I hope everyone has a lovely evening, and once again, thank you for being here.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.